What if the most dangerous weapon in a war wasn't a bomb, but a whisper? Imagine a single sentence spoken in a breadline or over a garden fence that could cause a city to panic. Think about a story, completely untrue, that could change what people ate, who they trusted, and how they saw the world. During the Second World War, this happened every day. Information was scarce, fear was plentiful, in that gap between fact and feeling, rumors grew. They were invisible, traveling faster than any army and infiltrating every home. These weren't just simple gossip. They were stories about secret weapons, disguised invaders, and government conspiracies. They could boost morale or crush it. They could unify a nation against a common enemy or turn neighbors against each other. Why did people believe that eating carrots could give them superhuman night vision? Was there really a fifth column of traitors living next door, ready to help an invasion? Did the enemy really drop poison candy from planes to harm children? These stories feel wild today, but millions of people believed them. They had to. In a world of uncertainty, a good story, even a terrifying one, felt more solid than silence. This is a look at those whispers, the wild, strange, and powerful rumors that became a hidden front in the war. Number 17, did the German leader really escape to South America? The story is a classic. It has all the elements of a thriller. A hidden bunker, a dramatic final stand, and then a disappearance. The official report said the German chancellor and his new wife had taken their own lives as enemy forces closed in on the capital in late April 1945. The bodies were hastily cremated, but the lack of definitive proof, the charred remains, and the sheer chaos of the city's fall created a perfect breeding ground for doubt. And that doubt quickly blossomed into one of the most enduring rumors of the 20th century: he got away. The story started almost immediately. Within days of the German surrender, whispers turned into headlines. He was spotted in Denmark. He was hiding in a castle in Spain, but one location kept coming up again and again: South America, specifically Argentina. The country had a large German immigrant population and a government that was at times sympathetic to the former German regime. It felt plausible. The rumors said he had traveled by submarine, arriving on the remote coast of Patagonia. He was living a quiet life, protected by loyal followers, perhaps in a fortified compound at the foot of the Andes. This wasn't just idle chatter. It was taken very seriously. The Federal Bureau of Investigation in the United States, under its director J. Edgar Hoover, maintained a thick file on the subject. For years, they investigated hundreds of alleged sightings. A letter would arrive saying a man matching the chancellor's description was seen working as a waiter in a small Argentinian town. Agents would be dispatched. Another report would claim he was managing a hotel in the mountains. The file, now declassified, is a fascinating look at how a rumor can drive a massive intelligence apparatus. It's filled with dead ends, mistaken identities, and hoaxes. One file, dated September 1945, details an informant's elaborate story about a submarine landing and the chancellor suffering from asthma and a stomach ulcer being whisked away to a ranch. The FBI followed up, but found nothing. The story was fueled by real events. Several high-ranking officials from the German regime did, in fact, escape to South America. They used established networks, often called rat lines, to flee justice. Men like Adolf Eichmann and Josef Mengele lived for years under assumed names in Argentina and Brazil. Every time one of these men was discovered, it lent more credibility to the idea that the biggest fish of all might have also slipped through the net. If they could do it, why couldn't he? Books and articles kept the rumor alive for decades. In his 1974 book, The Borman Brotherhood, writer William Stevenson explored the escape networks. More sensationalist works like The Grey Wolf, The Escape of Adolf, published in 2011 by British authors Gerard Williams and Simon Dunstan, argued that not only did the Chancellor escape, but he lived to the age of 73 in Patagonia and had 2 daughters. They based their claims on supposed eyewitnesses and local legends. Most historians, however, dismiss these theories. They point to the eyewitness testimony from the bunker from people who saw the bodies. They point to forensic evidence, including dental records examined by Soviet and later Russian authorities, that confirm the identity of the remains found outside the bunker. But the rumor persists because it offers a more satisfying narrative than the mundane, grim reality. The idea of a secret escape is more compelling than a desperate end in a concrete room. It suggests a conspiracy, a failure of justice, and a secret that is still out there waiting to be discovered. It turns a historical figure into a phantom, forever lurking in the shadows of what if. The official story is one of collapse and failure. The rumor is one of cunning and survival, a final act of defiance that continues to capture the imagination. What pieces of evidence from the bunker were immediately lost or mishandled in the chaos of 1945, leaving gaps that can never be filled? Were the early intelligence reports of an escape deliberately encouraged by Allied agencies to sow confusion and distrust among the remnants of the defeated regime? How much did the very real escape of other high-ranking figures actively distort the investigation into the Chancellor's fate for years afterward? Could modern DNA technology, if applied to every rumored burial site in Argentina, finally put the story to rest? Or would it only create more questions? Number 16, could a carrot really help you see in the dark? Your parents probably told you to eat your carrots. They help you see in the dark. It's a piece of folk wisdom passed down through generations. But it didn't start in a grandmother's kitchen. It started as a lie. A very clever lie, cooked up during a time of intense aerial conflict. It was a piece of propaganda so successful that it has become a permanent part of our culture. The story begins in the night skies over Britain in 1940 and 1941. The German Air Force was conducting a nightly bombing campaign. British cities were plunged into darkness by mandatory blackouts. In this terrifying darkness, a new kind of hero emerged: the Royal Air Force night fighter pilot. These pilots were having extraordinary success, shooting down enemy bombers with uncanny accuracy in what seemed like total blackness. Their kill counts were rising. The public, and more importantly, the enemy, wanted to know how were they doing it. The British government had a secret, a very big secret. It was a new technology called Airborne Interception AI radar. It was a small onboard radar system that could detect enemy aircraft from miles away, guiding the pilot toward the target through the dark. This technology gave the RAF a massive advantage. But if the German military found out about it, they would immediately start developing countermeasures, and that advantage would be lost. The secret had to be protected at all costs. So the Ministry of Information, the British government's propaganda arm, came up with a cover story. A simple, believable, and slightly folksy story. They told the newspapers that their pilots had developed exceptional night vision. And the reason for this superhuman ability was a special diet rich in carrots. The press ran with it. They published stories about pilots gorging on carrots to maintain their edge. One pilot in particular, John Cunningham, was nicknamed Cat's Eyes by the press. He was a leading night fighter ace, credited with 20 aerial victories, 19 of which were at night. The papers claimed his visual acuity was all down to his love of carrots. The public ate it up, literally. The Ministry of Food, facing wartime food shortages, saw a brilliant opportunity. Carrots were one of the few vegetables that were plentiful and not subject to rationing. They could be grown easily in home gardens, known as victory gardens. So they launched a massive domestic propaganda campaign. Posters appeared with characters like Dr. Carrot, urging people to eat more of the vegetable for their health and their eyesight. The government published recipes for everything from carrot fudge to carrot pudding, and a drink called Carolade. The campaign was a double success. It provided a brilliant cover for the secret radar technology, and it encouraged the British public to eat a healthy, readily available food source during a time of scarcity. The science behind it was just plausible enough to be believed. Carrots are rich in beta-carotene, which the body converts to vitamin A. Vitamin A is crucial for good vision. A severe deficiency in vitamin A can cause a condition called xerophthalmia, one symptom of which is night blindness. So eating carrots can help correct poor night vision if it's caused by a vitamin deficiency, but eating an excess of carrots will not give you superhuman night vision. It won't let you see a bomber in the dark from a mile away. The rumor worked because it was built on a tiny kernel of scientific truth. The lie became so deeply embedded in the public consciousness that it outlived the war by decades. The story of Cat's Eyes Cunningham and his carrot-fueled vision was told and retold. The secret of the AI radar eventually came out, but The myth had a life of its own. It became a piece of parental wisdom, a simple way to get children to eat their vegetables, its wartime origins completely forgotten by most. It stands as a perfect example of how a carefully crafted piece of misinformation designed for a specific military purpose can transform into an enduring cultural belief. Did German intelligence ever truly believe the carrot story, or did they dismiss it as obvious propaganda while secretly searching for the real technological advantage? How many tons of extra carrots were actually consumed by the British public as a direct result of this campaign, and did it have any measurable impact on national health statistics at the time? Were there any RAF pilots who genuinely believed the carrot myth themselves, or was the secret of the radar technology perfectly contained within the highest circles? Are there any surviving internal memos from the Ministry of Information that debate the ethics of spreading a scientific falsehood to the entire population, even for a good cause? Number 15, was there a secret code in the Daily Telegraph's crossword? It sounds like something from a spy novel. In the spring of 1944, Allied planners were in the final frantic stages of preparing for the largest amphibious invasion in history, the D-Day landings in Normandy. Secrecy was absolute. The code names for the operation were among the most closely guarded secrets in the world. Imagine the shock, then, when many of these code names started appearing as answers in the daily crossword puzzle of a major British newspaper, the Daily Telegraph. It started on May 2nd, 1944. The clue was one of the U.S. The answer was Utah, the code name for one of the 2 American landing beaches. A coincidence, perhaps. But then, on May 22nd, the answer to the clue, read Indian on the Missouri, was Omaha, the other American beach. The alarm bell started ringing at MI5, the British counterintelligence agency. This was getting suspicious. The crossword was compiled by a man named Leonard Daw, a 54-year-old school teacher from Surrey. The strange coincidences continued to pile up. Over the next few weeks, more top-secret codenames appeared. Overlord, the name for the entire Normandy operation, was an answer. Mulberry, the code name for the secret artificial harbors that were a linchpin of the invasion plan, appeared as well. The final straw came on June 1st, 1944, just 5 days before the planned invasion. The clue was Big Wig. The answer was Neptune, the code name for the naval phase of the landings. For the security officers at MI5, this was no longer a coincidence. It was a potential security breach of the highest order. They had to assume the worst, that the crossword was being used by a spy to transmit information to the enemy. 2 MI5 agents were dispatched to Dawes' school. They burst into his office and arrested him. They interrogated him for hours. Daw was terrified and bewildered. He insisted he had no idea what they were talking about. He was just a school teacher who enjoyed creating puzzles. He had no knowledge of any secret military plans. His explanation was that he often asked his students at the Strand School to help him come up with words to fill the puzzle grids. He would give them blank grids and ask them to fill them with interesting words, which he would then write clues for. The agents were skeptical. They searched his home and his papers, but found nothing incriminating. They investigated his background and found no links to any foreign powers. His story seemed outlandish. Could a group of schoolboys in Surrey really have stumbled upon the biggest military secrets of the war? It turned out yes. The school was located near a large military camp where American and Canadian soldiers were based. The boys would hang around the camp talking to the soldiers. In the run-up to the invasion, security was tight, but soldiers talk. They used slang and code names. It's believed the boys overheard loose talk from the soldiers and a mention of Omaha here, a reference to Overlord there, without understanding their significance. They were just unusual, interesting sounding words. They passed them on to their teacher, Leonard Daw, who, equally oblivious, put them in his crossword. MI5 eventually, and reluctantly accepted Daw's story. The sheer randomness of it was more believable than any spy conspiracy they could concoct. Daw was released, shaken but free, and told to burn all his notebooks. The incident was classified and remained a secret for decades. It was only in 1984, on the 40th anniversary of D-Day, that the story became public when a former student, Ronald French, came forward and explained what had happened. It was a bizarre footnote to a monumental event, a moment where a simple word game nearly caused a major security crisis. The rumor of a spy using the crossword was real, but the reality was far more mundane and, in its own way, far more remarkable. What if Leonard Daw had been lying and MI5 simply couldn't break him or find the evidence? Are there any sealed MI5 files from the interrogation that might contain details or doubts that were never made public? How many of the students who allegedly supplied the words were ever interviewed by security services? And are there any records of those conversations? Did German intelligence even notice the code names in the crossword? And if so, what was their analysis of the situation? Number 14, did the royal family flee London during the bombing? During the sustained bombing campaign against London, which began in September 1940, the city's residents faced nightly terror. Buildings crumbled, fires raged, and life was lived under constant threat. For the British government, maintaining public morale was as important as any military victory. A key symbol of national resilience was the royal family King George VI, his wife Queen Elizabeth, and their two daughters, Elizabeth and Margaret. The official story, promoted heavily by the Ministry of Information, was that the family was staying in London, sharing the danger with their people. But in the heavily bombed and deeply frightened working-class neighborhoods of the East End, a different story took hold. The rumor was that the royals had fled. The Whisper campaign suggested that the king and queen were not really sleeping at Buckingham Palace. Instead, they were whisked away each night to the safety of a country estate like Windsor Castle or even to a secret location in Canada. They only returned to London in the daytime for stage photo opportunities, walking through bombed-out streets to show solidarity before retreating to their safe haven. This rumor was corrosive. It suggested that the call for a stiff upper lip and shared sacrifice was a sham. It created a sense of us versus them, implying that the elite were protecting themselves while the common people were left to die. The rumor gained traction for several reasons. First, there was a natural class resentment and a deep-seated suspicion of authority. Second, the government's control of information, while necessary for security, also bred distrust. People knew they weren't being told the whole truth about the war, so they were inclined to believe unofficial stories. Third, the rumor had a kernel of truth, which made it much more powerful. The two princesses, Elizabeth and Margaret, had indeed been moved out of London to Windsor Castle for their safety. The government tried to keep this quiet, but news like that inevitably leaks out. If the children were gone, it seemed logical to assume the parents were taking similar precautions. The government and the royal family were acutely aware of how damaging this rumor could be. They fought back, not with denials, but with actions. The Queen famously stated, "The children won't go without me. I won't leave the king, and the king will never leave." This quote was widely publicized and became a powerful piece of counter-propaganda, but actions spoke louder than words. The king and queen made a point of being seen in London. They visited bomb sites, talked to rescue workers, and met with families who had lost their homes. They didn't just visit the prestigious West End. They made a conscious effort to visit the hardest hit areas in the East End, the very places where the rumors were most potent. Then, on September 13th, 1940, the German Air Force scored a direct hit on Buckingham Palace itself. Several bombs struck the palace, destroying the royal chapel and injuring some staff. The king and queen were in the building at the time, just a short distance from the explosions. This event, ironically, was a public relations gift. The news that the palace had been bombed and that the king and queen had narrowly escaped was broadcast across the nation and the world. It instantly killed the rumor that they were hiding in the countryside. The Queen's reported reaction was another masterstroke of communication. "I'm glad we've been bombed. It makes me feel I can look the East End in the face." From that moment on, they weren't just rulers, they were fellow Londoners, sharing the same risks as everyone else. The rumor of their flight vanished, replaced by a surge of public admiration and a powerful sense of shared identity. How close did the British government come to officially evacuating the royal family to Canada, a plan that was seriously considered under the codename Rockabye Baby? Are there any surviving mass observation diaries or reports that quantify how widespread the belief in the rumor actually was before the bombing of the palace? Did German propaganda broadcasts actively try to promote the rumor of the family's flight to sow discord in Britain? What would have happened to British morale and the monarchy itself if one of the bombs that struck Buckingham Palace had landed just 100 yards differently. Number 13 were American soldiers stealing all the British women. In 1942, a new army began to arrive in Britain. They were young, they were confident, and they seemed to have endless supplies of things that were severely rationed in the UK: chocolate, chewing gum, silk stockings, and money. They were the American GIs, and their arrival, part of the buildup for the eventual invasion of mainland Europe, created a massive culture clash that sparked a persistent and resentful rumor. The saying that spread across the country summed it up: the only trouble with the Americans was that they were overpaid, oversexed, and over here. The rumor wasn't that the GIs were an enemy. It was that they were a social problem. They were seen as loud, brash, and most importantly, they were stealing British women. The economic disparity was huge. A private in the U.S. Army earned about 5 times more than his British counterpart. With their smart uniforms, access to goods from the PX store, and pockets full of cash, they could offer young women a level of glamour and excitement that was impossible in austere, war-torn Britain. Dances were organized in village halls across the country, and local British men often found themselves unable to compete. The sight of a young local woman on the arm of a smiling American soldier became a common and often resented sight. This resentment festered and grew into a nationwide rumor mill. Stories spread about the GIs' loose morals and their supposed disrespect for British customs. They were accused of getting young women pregnant and then abandoning them. They were seen as treating relationships casually, a love 'em and leave 'em attitude that clashed with more traditional British courtship. The humorist George Orwell, in his diary entry for June 1st, 1942, noted the growing friction, writing about the dislike of the American troops and the perception that they were always chewing. The phrase overpaid, oversexed, and over here became a national catchphrase, a shorthand way of expressing a complex mix of jealousy, anxiety, and genuine social disruption. The authorities were well aware of the problem. The U.S. military and the British government produced pamphlets and films to try and smooth relations. One famous pamphlet for American soldiers was titled "Instructions for American Servicemen in Britain." It tried to explain British customs, warning GIs not to be too loud, not to brag about their pay, and to understand that British women were not necessarily easy. It contained advice like the British are reserved, not unfriendly, and don't criticize the king or queen. These efforts were only partially successful. The underlying tensions remained. The situation was further complicated by race. The American army was segregated at the time. The arrival of African American GIs, particularly in rural parts of Britain that had never seen a black person before, created another layer of social anxiety and rumor. While many Britons welcomed the black soldiers, some white American GIs tried to impose their own segregationist rules in British pubs and dance halls, leading to fights and further resentment from the British, who often sided with the African American soldiers. In the end, the rumor was an exaggeration, but one rooted in a real social phenomenon. Over the course of the war, an estimated 70,000 British women married American soldiers, becoming GI brides. Many of them emigrated to the United States after the war to start a new life. While many of these relationships were genuine love stories, the sheer scale of this social shift fueled the perception that a friendly invasion was taking place, one that was changing the fabric of British society, one dance and one date at a time. The rumor was a way for people to voice their anxieties about these rapid and often unsettling changes. How many official complaints were lodged with British police or military authorities regarding the conduct of American soldiers towards local women? Did the American military's own internal reports acknowledge the morale problem caused by the wealth gap between their soldiers and British troops? Are there any documented cases where British authorities requested that a specific U.S. unit be moved because of the social disruption it was causing? How did the post-war experiences of the GI brides in America compare to the glamorous life they had been promised by the soldiers? Part number 12 was the government faking the salvage drives. Saucepans for Spitfires. It was a rallying cry across Britain. During the war, the need for raw materials, especially metal for building aircraft, ships, and munitions, was immense. The government launched a series of massive nationwide salvage drives. People were encouraged to donate any scrap metal they had. They were told their old pots, pans, garden railings, and even historical artifacts would be melted down and reborn as weapons to fight the enemy. It was a powerful campaign that gave civilians on the home front a tangible way to contribute to the war effort. It made people feel like they were part of the fight, but as the war dragged on, a cynical rumor began to spread. The rumor was that the salvage drives were a hoax. The story went that the government didn't actually need all that scrap metal. People would see huge piles of donated railings and saucepans sitting in dumps for weeks or months on end, seemingly untouched and rusting in the rain. This led to the whisper that the metal was just being collected and then secretly dumped into the sea or buried in quarries. The real purpose of the drives, the rumor claimed, was not to gather materials, but to be a propaganda exercise. And it was just a way to keep the public busy, to maintain morale, and to create an illusion of shared sacrifice. This rumor was particularly damaging because it struck at the heart of the public's trust in the government. People had made real sacrifices. They had stripped their homes and cities of decorative ironwork, sometimes giving up cherished family heirlooms. The idea that these sacrifices were meaningless, that they had been tricked, was infuriating. The rumor was discussed in pubs, on buses, and over garden fences. It was a perfect example of wartime cynicism. The man in charge of the salvage effort was Lord Beaverbrook, the Minister of Aircraft Production. He was a dynamic and ruthless newspaper baron who was tasked with dramatically increasing the output of planes. His campaigns were aggressive and highly visible. He organized Spitfire funds where towns could raise money to buy their own fighter plane. The scrap metal drives were a key part of his public strategy. The visible evidence of the huge, unprocessed piles of metal was the primary fuel for the rumor. People couldn't understand the logistical challenge. They didn't see the complex process of sorting, grading, and transporting the different types of metal to the correct foundries, all while the transportation network was under immense strain from the war. All they saw was their sacrifice seemingly rotting away. The truth was more complicated than the rumor. The government absolutely did need the metal. Aluminum was in particularly high demand. The saucepans for Spitfire's campaign was specifically designed to collect aluminum. However, a lot of the metal collected, especially the cast iron from railings, was of lower quality and less useful than the government had hoped. There were indeed logistical bottlenecks. Some of the piles did sit for a long time, but the material was eventually used. Historians like Angus Calder, in his book The People's War, have shown that while the propaganda value of the drives was enormous, the material contribution was also significant, particularly in the early desperate years of the war. The government was aware of the rumor and tried to counter it with newsreels showing the scrap being melted down and processed. But a rumor like this is hard to kill. It fed on a pre-existing distrust of authority and a weariness with years of hardship and propaganda. It demonstrated a critical tension of the home front, the government's need to inspire and mobilize the population, and the public's growing skepticism and desire for unvarnished truth. The story of the salvage drives shows that even when people are united in a common cause, suspicion can still take root in a pile of rusting metal. Are there any classified government documents from the time that express official concern about the hoax rumor and its effect on public morale? How much of the collected scrap metal was ultimately deemed unusable and was in fact dumped or buried, and do any records of this exist? Did German propaganda broadcasts ever pick up on and amplify this rumor to try and undermine the British home front? Were there any specific regions or cities where the rumor was more prevalent, and if so, why? Number 11, were people painting giant arrows on their roofs for enemy bombers? In a time of total war, fear of the enemy within can be as potent as fear of the enemy without. In Britain, this fear manifested in a persistent and terrifying rumor that spies and traitors were living among them, actively helping the enemy. One of the most common forms this rumor took was the story of the guiding signs. People became convinced that fifth columnists, a term for internal traitors that originated during the Spanish Civil War, were using secret signals to guide German bombers to their targets. The stories were specific and widespread. People would report seeing strange lights flashing from their neighbors' windows at night, supposedly signaling to aircraft overhead. Their farmers claimed to find arrows laid out with stones or cut into the turf of their fields, pointing directly toward nearby factories or airfields. But the most pervasive version of the rumor involved markings on rooftops. People began to believe that spies were painting large X's or other symbols on the roofs of houses or commercial buildings. These marks, invisible from the ground, would supposedly be visible to bombardiers from thousands of feet in the air, serving as a perfect aiming point to hit a nearby target, like a munitions factory, a railway station, or a power plant. This rumor created an atmosphere of intense paranoia. Neighbors began to watch each other with suspicion. Any unusual activity could be misinterpreted as espionage. A new coat of paint on a roof, a strange pattern of laundry hanging on a line, a light left on by mistake, all could be seen as evidence of treason. The government's own "Careless Talk Costs Lives" poster campaign, which encouraged people to be vigilant about what they said, inadvertently fed this paranoia. It created a mindset where everyone was a potential spy and every small detail could be a clue. The authorities took these reports seriously, at least initially. Police and air raid precautions, ARP wardens, were obligated to investigate every claim. They would climb onto rooftops and inspect fields, searching for these supposed signals. But they never found any credible evidence. The arrows in fields almost always turned out to be old agricultural markings or geological features. The flashing lights were usually reflections, or someone moving around their blacked-out home with a candle. The markings on roofs were non-existent. The rumor was fueled by a psychological need to make sense of the seemingly random horror of the bombing. It was easier for people to believe that a bomb had hit their street because a traitor had guided it there, rather than to accept the terrifying reality that it was simply a matter of chance. A spy could, in theory, be caught and punished. Random chance was an enemy you couldn't fight. The historian Tom Harrison, a co-founder of the Mass Observation Project, which documented everyday life in Britain, noted how these spy scare stories peaked during periods of intense bombing. They were a direct response to fear and a feeling of helplessness. Despite the complete lack of evidence, the rumor persisted throughout the war. It spoke to a deep anxiety about betrayal and the idea that the enemy was not just in the sky but living next door. It turned communities in on themselves, transforming the home front into a landscape of imagined conspiracies. The truth was that the German Air Force relied on radio navigation beams and later simple maps and aerial reconnaissance to find their targets. They didn't need and were not looking for crude symbols painted on rooftops by supposed spies on the ground. The arrows on the roofs existed only in the frightened imaginations of the people below. Were any individuals ever prosecuted or officially interned based on false accusations of signaling to the enemy, and what happened to them? How many man-hours did police and ARP wardens waste investigating these false claims, and did it divert them from more important duties? Did the government ever consider a public information campaign to debunk the rumor, or did they fear it would cause even more panic? Are there any German Air Force archives that contain any intelligence reports, however speculative, about potential ground signals from sympathizers in Britain? Number 10, was the German leader a compassionate vegetarian? Propaganda is a strange thing. It doesn't always involve making your enemy look like a monster. Sometimes the most effective technique is to make them look strange, ridiculous, or even surprisingly human in a way that feels unnerving. During the war, one of the most persistent sets of rumors circulating among the Allies about the German Chancellor had nothing to do with his military or political ambitions. It was about his personal life and specifically his diet. The story was that he was a committed vegetarian, an animal lover, and a teetotaler. This rumor was particularly potent because it was largely true, which made it all the more bizarre and fascinating to the British and American public. The German state's propaganda machine, especially in the early years, actively promoted this image. They wanted to portray their leader as a man of discipline, restraint, and purity, a stark contrast to the supposedly decadent and corrupt leaders of the West. They painted a picture of a man who was so sensitive he couldn't bear the thought of animal suffering, a man who preferred mineral water to alcohol, and who followed a strict vegetarian diet for his health. Allied propaganda picked up on this and used it in a completely different way. They didn't deny it, they amplified it, but with a sinister twist. For the British, who were enduring meat rationing and whose culture was heavily centered around things like the Sunday roast, the idea of a vegetarian leader was inherently odd. It made him seem alien and eccentric. Allied propagandists like the influential journalist Sefton Delmer, who ran black propaganda operations for the British, used this image to paint the Chancellor as a hypocrite. They would broadcast stories to Germany suggesting that while he was forcing hardship and rationing on his own people, he was secretly enjoying the finest delicacies. But for the public in Britain and America, the rumor was simply a source of endless fascination and psychological dissonance. How could a man responsible for so much aggression and destruction be so concerned about the welfare of animals? It didn't compute. It made him a paradox. Newspapers and magazines ran articles discussing his diet in detail. They talked about his love for his dogs. This created a strange, unsettling portrait. It was much easier to conceptualize a leader as a simple, one-dimensional monster. The rumor of his vegetarianism and love for animals made him more complex, and in some ways more disturbing. It suggested a profound disconnect, a man who could show compassion for a dog but not for people. The rumor was further complicated by conflicting reports. Some stories claimed his vegetarianism was a myth, a propaganda tool to create an ascetic image. Others, from people who had dined with him, confirmed it. The historian Robert Payne, in his biography, suggests the diet began in earnest around 1931, possibly after the death of his niece, and was linked more to a fear of illness and hypochondria than to moral principles. He was known to suffer from stomach cramps and believed a meat-free diet would alleviate them. So this rumor was a complex web of truth, propaganda, and counter-propaganda. It started as a tool for the German regime to build a particular image of their leader. It was then co-opted by the Allies to mock him and paint him as an oddball. And for the general public, it became a strange and unsettling fact that made the enemy leader seem even more incomprehensible. It was a perfect example of how a personal detail, a simple dietary choice, could become a weapon in a psychological war, used by all sides to shape perception and sow confusion. What did the German public actually think about their leader's vegetarianism, and was it a source of pride or private ridicule? Are there any surviving menus or kitchen records from his residences that could definitively settle the question of how strict his diet really was? How did Allied intelligence agencies analyze this personal trait? Did they see it as a weakness, a sign of instability, or simply an irrelevant eccentricity? Did animal rights or vegetarian groups at the time ever comment on or try to use the fact that the enemy leader shared their dietary choice? Number 9, what were the gremlins wrecking the airplanes? The pilots and aircrew in the Royal Air Force during the war lived with constant mechanical peril. In the early days of high-altitude flight, engines would fail, instruments would freeze, and electrical systems would malfunction for no apparent reason. In the face of these inexplicable failures, a myth was born. The pilots started to blame the problems on tiny, mischievous creatures they called gremlins. A gremlin was a foot-tall imp that lived on aircraft, and whose sole purpose was to cause chaos and sabotage. The rumor started in the RAF as a piece of pilot's folklore, a private joke to cope with the stress and random dangers of their job. If your fuel gauge suddenly gave a false reading, it was a gremlin. If your machine gun jammed at a critical moment, a gremlin did it. Right? If your landing gear wouldn't deploy, the gremlins were at it again. The myth developed its own complex rules. Gremlins hated being airborne but loved the taste of aviation fuel. They used tiny hammers, saws, and pliers to snip wires, clog fuel lines, and punch holes in the fuselage. They were a convenient scapegoat for the terrifying and often fatal mysteries of mechanical failure. The story might have remained a piece of internal RAF slang, but it was picked up by a young pilot and author named Roald Dahl. In 1942, Dahl, who had served as an RAF fighter pilot, was stationed in Washington, D.C. He wrote a story for Walt Disney called The Gremlins, based on the folklore he knew from his service. The story was intended to be developed into a full-length animated film. The film was never completed, but the book was published in 1943. It was a huge success. The story of the Gremlins, these little saboteurs of the sky, broke out of the confines of the RAF and entered the public imagination in Britain and, most significantly, in America. The rumor spread like wildfire through aircraft factories on the home front. If a part was faulty or a tool went missing from a workbench, it was blamed on gremlins. The myth provided a humorous, non-threatening way to talk about human error and mechanical faults in the high-pressure environment of wartime production. Factory workers would joke about degremlining a new bomber before it was sent out. The U.S. Army Air Forces even produced official training films and posters warning airmen about the dangers of gremlins, using them as a memorable way to reinforce maintenance checklists and pre-flight procedures. A poster might show a gremlin sawing through a fuel line with the caption, "Check it. Don't let the gremlins get you." The rumor became a full-blown cultural phenomenon. Warner Bros. Released cartoons featuring Bugs Bunny and other characters battling gremlins on their planes. The creatures became a part of the war's popular mythology. They were a perfect wartime rumor because they served so many purposes. And for aircrews, they were a coping mechanism, a way of personifying the impersonal threat of mechanical failure. For the government and military, they were a useful training tool, a lighthearted way to teach serious lessons about maintenance and vigilance. And for the public, they were a fascinating and slightly scary piece of folklore, a modern myth born from a modern war. The gremlins provided a story, a name, and a face for the invisible anxieties of a new technological age. Did any RAF or USAF official reports ever seriously study the gremlin myth as a psychological phenomenon affecting aircrew morale? Are there any records of aircraft accidents that were officially, even if humorously, attributed to gremlin activity in preliminary field reports? How did German or Japanese intelligence interpret the intercepted Allied communications that mentioned gremlins? Did they dismiss it as code or investigate it as a new secret weapon? Besides Roald Dahl, were there other writers or journalists who tried to document the origins of the gremlin myth at the time, and have their notes been lost? Number 8 was the enemy dropping poisoned candy for children. Of all the rumors that circulated on the home front, few were as terrifying for parents as the stories of poisoned sweets. The rumor took various forms, but the core of it was always the same. The enemy was deliberately targeting children by dropping candy, chocolates, or chewing gum from their planes. These treats, however, were laced with poison or explosives. The stories often included graphic details of a child finding a seemingly innocent chocolate bar in a field, only to become violently ill or lose a hand when it exploded. This rumor was particularly prevalent in Britain during the periods of heavy bombing. It played on the deepest fears of any parent, the inability to protect their child from harm. The war had already brought danger directly into their homes with the nightly air raids. This rumor suggested a new, more insidious threat, one that targeted the most innocent and vulnerable. It was psychological warfare at its most brutal, whether it was deliberately started by the enemy or more likely a homegrown product of civilian fear. The government took this rumor very seriously because of its potential to cause mass panic. Police forces across the country issued public warnings. Schools held special assemblies to instruct children never to pick up anything they found on the ground. The Ministry of Information created posters and public information films with stark warnings. One famous poster showed a beautiful fountain pen lying on the ground with the caption, "Don't touch. It may be a bomb." The campaign was broadened to include anything that might look tempting to a child: toys, pens, and especially sweets. The rumor was given a veneer of credibility by the fact that the enemy did use small, cleverly disguised explosive devices. The butterfly bomb, for example, was a small anti-personnel bomb dropped in large numbers. Its casing was designed to flutter down slowly, and it was often brightly colored, making it look like a toy to an unsuspecting person. There were documented cases of civilians, including children, being killed or injured by these devices. So, while there is no evidence that the Germans ever dropped poison candy, the very real threat of disguised explosives made the candy rumor seem terrifyingly plausible. People simply connected the dots. If the enemy would disguise a bomb as a toy, why wouldn't they disguise poison as a sweet? The rumor was a powerful example of how fear can create its own reality. There were no confirmed cases of any child being poisoned by enemy-dropped candy. Yet, the story was told and retold across the country, often as a first-hand account I heard from a friend whose cousin's boy. This is how rumors work. They gain authenticity through repetition and by being attached to a supposed eyewitness, however distant. The story was also a way for people to understand and process the enemy's perceived barbarity. In a total war, where civilians were on the front line, the idea that the enemy would deliberately target children felt like the ultimate expression of evil. The rumor, though false, helped to solidify public resolve and hatred for the opposing regime. It reinforced the idea that they were fighting against an enemy with no moral compass, making any sacrifice seem necessary. How many official police investigations were launched into alleged cases of poisoned candy, and what were their ultimate conclusions? Did the British government's own public warnings intended to protect children from real explosives inadvertently end up amplifying the false rumor about poisoned sweets? Are there any records of German propaganda strategists ever considering or rejecting the idea of using such a tactic? To what extent did this rumor cause real psychological trauma to children who were taught to fear the very things that should bring them joy? Number 7. Was there really a fifth column ready to help an invasion? In the spring of 1940, as country after country in Western Europe fell to the advancing German armies, a new and terrifying word entered the public vocabulary: fifth column. The term referred to a secret army of sympathizers and spies already inside a country, ready to rise up and help an invading force through sabotage and spreading disinformation. The fear of a fifth column became a national obsession in Britain, creating an atmosphere of suspicion and paranoia that swept the country. The rumor was that these traitors were everywhere, disguised as ordinary citizens, just waiting for the signal to strike. The phrase itself was coined during the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s, but it was the rapid fall of Norway in April 1940 that cemented the idea in the British mind. The press reported, with some exaggeration, that the German invasion of Norway had been successful largely because of the help of internal traitors who had sabotaged defenses and spread confusion. The British public looked at this and thought it could happen here. The fear was that there were thousands of German nationals, British fascists, and other sympathizers living in Britain who were part of an organized network, a secret fifth column controlled from Berlin. This fear was stoked by the government. The new Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, gave a famous speech in which he warned of the odious apparatus of foreign intrigue and the fifth column that betrays a nation to its conqueror. This was a deliberate strategy to awaken the country to the threat of invasion and to encourage vigilance. But it also had the effect of pouring fuel on the fire of public paranoia. Posters appeared with slogans like, "Be like Dad, keep mum," and "Careless talk costs lives," reinforcing the idea that spies could be listening anywhere. The result was a wave of spy mania. People began to see fifth columnists everywhere. German refugees who had fled the regime, many of them Jewish, were viewed with deep suspicion. Anyone with a foreign-sounding name or a slight accent was a potential suspect. The author George Orwell wrote about this period, describing how people would report their neighbors for supposedly suspicious behavior, like owning a shortwave radio or having unusual patterns in their curtains. A popular rumor claimed that nuns were actually disguised male enemy paratroopers. Another suggested that ice cream vendors were using their routes to map out the towns for an invasion. The government responded to this public pressure with a policy of mass internment. In May and June of 1940, under the authority of Defense Regulation 18B, the government rounded up and imprisoned thousands of enemy aliens, mostly German, Austrian, and Italian nationals, without trial. This included many genuine refugees who had fled persecution. In addition, prominent British fascists, including the leader of the British Union of Fascists, Oswald Mosley, were also interned. This was a drastic measure and a significant curtailment of civil liberties, but it was seen as a necessary precaution against the fifth column threat. In reality, the organized fifth column that people feared did not exist. There was no secret army of thousands of traitors waiting for a signal. While German intelligence did have some agents and sympathizers in Britain, their network was small, disorganized, and largely ineffective. British counterintelligence, MI5, had been very successful in rounding up most of the real German agents. The Great Fifth Column Scare of 1940 was a product of fear, official propaganda, and the psychological shock of seeing friendly nations collapse so quickly. It was a rumor that led to real injustices and turned neighbor against neighbor, a stark reminder that in wartime, the fear of betrayal can be as powerful as any army. How many of the thousands of people interned as enemy aliens were later proven to be completely innocent, and were they ever compensated for their wrongful imprisonment? Did the widespread public paranoia actually help British counterintelligence by generating useful leads, or did it simply overwhelm them with false reports? Are there any captured German intelligence documents that reveal what their actual plans were for using sympathizers within Britain during a potential invasion? What was the long-term psychological impact on communities that had been torn apart by mutual suspicion during the spy mania of 1940? Number 6. Did Churchill have a body double? And Winston Churchill was not just Britain's wartime prime minister, he was a symbol. His bulldog, like face, his cigar, his V for Victory sign, they were all instantly recognizable and a source of inspiration. But his high-profile and defiant stance also made him a prime target for enemy assassination attempts. As he traveled around the country and overseas for high-stakes meetings, the risk was enormous. Out of this very real danger, a persistent rumor grew that Churchill used a body double to protect himself. The story went that the government had found a man who bore an uncanny resemblance to the prime minister. This man, the rumor claimed, would be used in situations that were considered too dangerous for the real Churchill. He would ride in motorcades, appear at public functions, or even attend preliminary meetings to throw off any potential assassins. The real Churchill, meanwhile, would be kept safe, traveling separately and securely. It was a story that made perfect sense. It was a clever deception, a classic piece of spycraft that seemed both plausible and prudent. The rumor was given life by the existence of a man named Alfred F. Jones. He was an actor who, it was said, was hired by British intelligence because of his striking similarity to Churchill. The story, which gained significant traction after the war, was that Jones played the part of Churchill on numerous occasions. The 1974 film The Eagle Has Landed, based on a novel by Jack Higgins, used a similar plot device, further cementing the idea of a Churchill double in the popular imagination. However, most serious historians, including Churchill's official biographer Sir Martin Gilbert, have found no evidence to support this rumor. There are no official documents, no diary entries, and no credible eyewitness accounts to suggest that a body double was ever used. Churchill himself was a man who seemed to court danger rather than shy away from it. He famously stood on rooftops to watch the London air raids and often drove through recently bombed areas with little regard for his own safety. The idea of him meekly sending a double into harm's way seems completely out of character. So where did the rumor come from? It likely originated from a combination of sources. The public was aware of the risks Churchill was taking, and the body double story was a comforting one. It suggested that there was a clever plan in place to protect their indispensable leader. It was also fed by the very real use of deception by the Allies in other areas of the war. Operations like Mincemeat, where a corpse with false papers was used to deceive the enemy about the invasion of Sicily, showed that British intelligence was more than capable of such elaborate tricks. If they could invent a fake officer, why not a fake prime minister? The actor Alfred F. Jones did exist, and he did look a bit like Churchill. He even played him in a 1944 film called The Glorious Days. It's likely that his work as an actor, combined with the public's anxiety and the known cunning of British intelligence, all merged to create a rumor that was too good not to be true. It was a story that people wanted to believe. It added a layer of intrigue and cleverness to the war effort, and provided a psychological safety net for a nation that depended so heavily on one man. The rumor of the double was a testament not to a real conspiracy, but to the immense importance of Churchill's life in the eyes of the public. Are there any sealed intelligence files from the war that mention plans, even if they were never executed, to use a body double for a high-ranking official? Was the actor Alfred F. Jones ever approached or vetted by any government agency for any reason, or was his connection to the story purely a post-war invention? How did enemy intelligence agencies assess the security around Churchill, and did their reports ever mention the possibility of a decoy? Did Churchill himself ever hear this rumor? And if so, is there any record of his reaction to the idea? Number 5 was a death ray about to end the war. Science fiction and reality blurred during the war. The rapid development of new technologies like radar, jet engines, and long-range rockets made it seem like anything was possible. In this atmosphere of incredible scientific advancement, rumors of superweapons were common on all sides. One of the most enduring and fantastical of these was the rumor of a death ray, a directed energy weapon that could supposedly vaporize planes in the sky or stop engines from miles away. The idea of a death ray wasn't new. It had been a staple of science fiction writers like H.G. Wells for decades. But during the war, the rumor took on a new urgency and credibility. People on the Allied side whispered that British or American scientists were on the verge of a breakthrough. They spoke of a secret research facility, perhaps in a remote part of Scotland or the American desert, where a device was being perfected that would make the enemy air force obsolete overnight. It was a deeply hopeful rumor, a belief in a silver bullet that could end the war quickly and decisively. The rumor was fueled by a real-life scientific puzzle. In 1935, Robert Watson Watt, a British physicist, was asked by the Air Ministry to investigate the feasibility of building a death ray that could destroy enemy aircraft. After doing the calculations, he concluded that the amount of energy required would be enormous, and that building such a weapon was impossible with current technology. However, he also noted in his report that the radio waves used in the theoretical ray might be able to bounce off an aircraft and be detected. This suggestion led directly to the development of radar. So, the quest for a death ray, complete fantasy, accidentally led to one of the most important real technologies of the war. The government, of course, kept the development of radar a secret, which allowed the death ray rumors to continue unchecked. The rumor wasn't confined to the Allies. In Germany, the state's propaganda machine actively promoted the idea of Wunderwaffen or wonder weapons. As the tide of the war turned against them, the regime promised its people that secret new weapons were being developed that would snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. While this referred to real projects like the V-1 flying bomb and the V-2 rocket, it also created a space for more fantastical rumors to flourish, including various types of energy weapons or rays. This was a deliberate strategy to keep public morale from collapsing. The death ray rumor demonstrates how wartime anxieties and hopes can latch onto scientific concepts. People knew that scientists were unlocking the secrets of the atom and harnessing the electromagnetic spectrum. A death ray didn't seem that much more of a leap than television or radar, things that were themselves miraculous to most people. The rumor persisted because it offered a simple solution to a complex and terrifying problem. It was easier to imagine a single brilliant invention ending the war than to contemplate the years of grinding conflict that lay ahead. It was a technological fantasy, a dream of a clean, swift victory in a war that was anything but. Are there any declassified documents that show government scientists continue to research directed energy weapons in secret, even after the initial negative reports? How did the rumors of an Allied death ray affect the strategic planning of the German military, if at all? Did any specific inexplicable aircraft failures on either side get attributed to a secret ray weapon by military intelligence at the time? Was the public's belief in a potential superweapon a net positive for morale, or did it create a risk of massive disillusionment when the weapon failed to appear? Number 4, or secret peace talks happening. In any long and difficult war, one of the most persistent and emotionally charged rumors is the rumor of peace. Throughout the Second World War, waves of whispers would sweep through the civilian population on all sides, suggesting that secret peace negotiations were underway. These rumors were a powerful reflection of the public's deep yearning for an end to the conflict, the rationing, and the loss of life. But they were also dangerous, as they could lead to complacency or profound disappointment. The rumors often had very specific details. They might claim that a neutral country like Switzerland or Sweden was hosting secret talks between high-level diplomats. They might name a specific between perhaps a businessman or a member of a royal family. The stories would suggest that a deal was close, that the war could be over in a matter of weeks. This kind of rumor was most common during periods of military stalemate or after a particularly costly battle when people were desperate for good news. It was a form of collective wishful thinking. The rumor was particularly complex because at various points, secret feelers and back-channel communications did actually take place. This wasn't a rumor born from nothing. For example, there were known contacts between British and German individuals in the early years of the war, though these never amounted to official negotiation. Later in the war, as the German position became more desperate. Various German officials, often acting without the approval of their leadership, did try to open channels with the Western Allies, hoping to negotiate a separate peace that would allow Germany to continue fighting against the Soviet Union. The Operation Sunrise talks in Switzerland in 1945, which led to the surrender of German forces in Italy, were a real example of such secret negotiations. These real, albeit limited contacts provided the seeds for much wilder public rumors. A small exploratory meeting between two low-level officials could be exaggerated by the rumor mill into a full-blown peace conference involving the leaders themselves. The problem for the governments was that they could neither confirm nor deny these rumors without compromising real intelligence operations or revealing their strategic intentions. The official public stance of the Allied leadership, particularly after the Casablanca Conference in 1943, was a policy of unconditional surrender. This policy was designed to reassure their Soviet allies and to make it clear to the German people that there would be no negotiated end to the war. But this hardline public stance was at odds with the public's desperate hope for peace, creating a perfect environment for rumors of secret deals to thrive. The German regime also had to contend with peace rumors, but they treated them as a threat to morale. The state's propaganda machine would denounce any such talk as enemy propaganda designed to weaken the people's will to fight. They insisted that total victory was the only option, yet the public, facing bombing and immense hardship, continued to whisper about the possibility of a negotiated settlement. The peace rumor was a barometer of public morale. When people were hopeful, the rumor was of an imminent and favorable peace. When they were fearful or despairing, the rumor was of a sellout, a secret deal that would betray their sacrifices. It was a story that reflected the deepest emotional needs of a population at war, the overwhelming desire for it all to be over, and the profound fear that it might end badly. What was the most significant real peace feeler from the German side that was rejected by the Allies, and what were the potential consequences of that rejection? How did Allied intelligence use fake peace rumors as a tool of psychological warfare to create division within the German leadership? Are there any records of how stock markets or black markets reacted to the spread of peace rumors during the war? Did the persistent hope for a negotiated peace among the German public weaken their will to fight in the final years, or did the unconditional surrender policy actually strengthen it? Number 3 was the enemy poisoning the water supply. It's one of the oldest fears in warfare, the poisoning of the wells. The idea of an enemy contaminating the water supply is a primal terror, a threat that is silent, invisible, and affects everyone. During the Second World War, this ancient fear was updated for the modern age. Rumors constantly swept through cities in both Britain and the United States that enemy agents were about to dump poison into the reservoirs that supplied the civilian population. The rumor was simple and terrifying. A story would start that a man had been caught near a reservoir with a suspicious package, or that a strange substance had been found in the water. The poison was usually said to be something fast-acting and deadly, like cyanide. The rumor would spread with incredible speed, causing localized panic. People would start frantically boiling their water or rushing to buy bottled water if it was even available. The fear was that a single act of sabotage could kill thousands of people before anyone even realized what was happening. In Britain, the threat was taken very seriously from the very beginning of the war. Reservoirs and water treatment plants were identified as critical infrastructure. They were placed under guard, often by the Home Guard, Britain's volunteer defense force. Barbed wire fences were erected, and access was severely restricted. These visible security measures, intended to reassure the public, sometimes had the opposite effect. Seeing armed guards around the local reservoir only served to confirm in people's minds that the threat must be real and imminent. In the United States, the same fear took hold, especially after the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. The fear of sabotage on the home front was intense. The Office of Civilian Defense published pamphlets and posters warning of the threat. In a 1942 publication titled "What to Do in an Air Raid," it gave specific instructions: if the water tastes or smells unusual, do not drink it. Report the fact to your local waterworks. This official advice, while practical, also legitimized the fear. J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI, announced that his agency was on high alert for any attempts to poison water supplies. There were countless false alarms. In one incident in a small American town, a panic was started when a resident noticed a strange film on the surface of the water in a local pond that fed into the town's supply. The town was in an uproar until a biologist identified the poison as a harmless, naturally occurring algae bloom. In another case, workers cleaning a water tower were reported as saboteurs. These incidents, which often made local newspapers, kept the rumor alive and well throughout the war. The reality is that successfully poisoning a modern city's water supply is incredibly difficult. The sheer volume of water in a reservoir means that an enormous amount of poison would be needed to make it lethal. Furthermore, the water goes through a complex filtration and chlorination process, which would neutralize many common poisons. Enemy intelligence knew this. While plans for sabotage against infrastructure like dams or power plants were real, the widespread poisoning of reservoirs was never a serious strategic goal. But the public didn't know the science. They only knew the fear. The rumor of the poisoned water was a powerful psychological weapon, even if it was a self-inflicted one. It preyed on a fundamental vulnerability and a feeling of helplessness, turning a source of life, a simple glass of water, into a potential source of death. Did any enemy agent ever actually get captured while attempting to contaminate a water source, or were all such incidents false alarms? What specific chemical or biological agents did Allied governments fear most, and what secret countermeasures did they have in place? How many resources were diverted to guarding water supplies across the UK and US, and did this have an impact on other defense efforts? Are there any captured enemy documents that detail their own analysis of the vulnerability of Allied water systems, and what were their conclusions? Number 2, who was Lord Haw Haw, and how did he know so much? Every night, families across Britain would gather around their wireless radios. They would tune past the BBC's respectable tones and, with a mixture of fear and fascination, listen to the enemy. From Germany, a voice would boom out in a strange, exaggeratedly upper-class English accent, "Germany calling! Germany calling!" This was the voice of Lord Haw Haw, the most famous and effective propaganda broadcaster of the war. But the most frightening thing about him wasn't just what he said, it was the rumor about what he seemed to know. The rumor was that Lord Haw Haw had supernatural, or at least incredibly detailed, knowledge of what was happening in Britain. He would taunt his listeners with eerily specific information. He would mention a town, a street, or even a specific building, and then say that it would be the target of the next bombing raid. The most famous version of this rumor was that he could tell you the time on a specific town's clock. He might say, for example, the clock on the town hall in Coventry is 10 minutes slow tonight, but it won't matter after our bombers visit. When a raid did happen in that area, it seemed to confirm his omniscience. This rumor was terrifying. It suggested a massive and highly effective spy network operating throughout Britain. It implied that there were traitors everywhere feeding information directly to the enemy's propaganda ministry. It made people feel that they were not safe anywhere, that the enemy knew their every move. It was psychological warfare of the highest order, designed to create an atmosphere of paranoia and to shatter public morale. People would listen to his broadcasts, desperate to hear if their own town would be named next. The man behind the Lord Haw Haw persona was William Joyce, an American-born fascist who had lived in Britain and fled to Germany at the start of the war. He was a committed believer in the German regime's cause. His broadcasts were a mix of news, commentary, and propaganda, all designed to portray Germany as winning the war and Britain as a decadent nation led by corrupt politicians. His strange, nasal, upper-crust accent, which was actually fake, was what earned him the "ha-ha" nickname from a British radio critic. But did he really have the detailed local knowledge the rumor claimed? The answer is no. The myth of his all-knowing power was a product of a few clever tricks and the public's own fearful imagination. The German propaganda service would get their information from a variety of sources. They monitored British regional newspapers and radio broadcasts. They had detailed maps and tourist guidebooks of Britain. They could combine this general information to create an illusion of specific knowledge. For example, they might know from a local newspaper that a particular factory in a town was working on a war contract. Joyce could then mention that factory in a broadcast. If that town was later bombed as part of a general raid on industrial areas, it would seem like a prophecy fulfilled. The story about the town clocks was a classic case of confirmation bias. Joyce never actually named a specific clock and predicted its bombing. The rumor was an urban legend. People would hear a raid, and then someone would claim after the fact that Lord Haw had mentioned their town's clock earlier. The story was so compelling that it was repeated as fact. The British government was very concerned about the effect of Joyce's broadcasts. At first, they tried to jam his signal, but this was largely ineffective. They then switched tactics using the BBC and newspapers to ridicule him and expose the lies in his broadcasts. But for many, the fear that he knew their secrets was stronger than any official denial. He remained a bogeyman, a disembodied, taunting voice that haunted the British airwaves throughout the war. What was the true size and effectiveness of the German spy network in Britain, and did it ever provide Joyce with any genuinely specific real-time intelligence for his broadcasts? Are there any surviving scripts or production notes from the Germany Calling broadcasts that show how the information was gathered and used? How did the British government's mass observation project track the public's reaction to Lord Haw, and what did their data reveal about his impact on morale? William Joyce was captured after the war and tried for treason. What did he himself say during his trial about the sources of his information? Number one were paratroopers disguised as nuns. Of all the wild rumors that circulated during the war, perhaps none was as strange or as persistent as the story of the disguised paratroopers. As the German army swept through the Netherlands and Belgium in May 1940, stories began to emerge of a new and terrifying tactic. The rumor was that German paratroopers were landing behind enemy lines disguised as civilians to sow chaos and confusion. And the most popular and vivid version of this rumor was that they were disguised as nuns. The image was instantly memorable and deeply unsettling. A group of nuns, symbols of peace and piety, would be seen walking down a road or seeking shelter. Suddenly, they would produce hidden machine guns from beneath their habits and open fire. Or, a local would become suspicious because they noticed the nuns were wearing military-style boots under their robes. The story spread like wildfire, first among the fleeing refugees from the Low Countries, and then, with their arrival, into France and Britain. It seemed to confirm that the enemy was not just powerful, but also diabolically cunning, willing to violate any sacred norm to achieve victory. The rumor arrived in Britain at a moment of supreme national anxiety. The country was facing the imminent threat of invasion. The government was desperately trying to organize a civilian defense force, the Home Guard. In this atmosphere of fear and improvisation, the nun rumor took deep root. It became a cautionary tale, a warning to be vigilant and to trust no one. Leaflets and posters for the Home Guard sometimes referenced the threat of disguised paratroopers. The story was repeated in newspapers and on the radio. It became an accepted, if terrifying, fact of modern warfare. The truth, however, is that there is not a single documented case of German paratroopers ever being disguised as nuns. The German paratroopers, the Fallschirmjäger, were an elite force who relied on speed, surprise, and overwhelming firepower, not disguises. The rumor appears to have been a complete fabrication, a piece of battlefield folklore that grew out of the chaos and terror of the invasion. So, why did it start, and why was it so widely believed? Historians like L.F. Ellis in his official history, The War in France and Flanders, 1939 to 1940, believe the rumor was a product of fifth column panic. The speed of the German advance was so shocking that people struggled to explain it. The idea of hidden traitors and disguised soldiers provided an answer. It was easier to believe they had been defeated by trickery than by superior military tactics. The nun detail was likely added because it was so visually and emotionally potent. It combined the sacred and the profane in a way that was both horrifying and unforgettable. There was also a tiny grain of truth that may have helped the rumor grow. German intelligence did drop some agents behind the lines, and German pilots who were shot down would sometimes try to acquire civilian clothes to aid their escape. Furthermore, the German army did make use of Brandenburgers, special forces units who sometimes wore enemy uniforms for specific small-scale commando operations. But these were isolated incidents, a far cry from the rumored armies of machine gun-toting nuns. The rumor was a classic example of wartime hysteria, a story that perfectly captured the anxieties of the moment. It was a myth that armed the Home Guard with suspicion and taught a generation of civilians that in a total war, the enemy could be anyone, anywhere, even hiding behind the most innocent of faces. Are there any records of Allied soldiers in 1940 ever actually firing on a group of real nuns out of fear and paranoia? Did German intelligence ever hear about the rumor and consider using it to their advantage by deliberately spreading it to increase panic? How many different variations of the disguised paratrooper rumor were there, and which one was the most widespread? What does the extreme and specific nature of the nun rumor tell us about the cultural and religious anxieties that existed just beneath the surface of wartime society?